Why was poverty in Ireland so bad? Short answer, the system of land ownership. The rent prices, the size of the farm plots, the laws pertaining to tenants' rights, all of it was terribly skewed against the Irish. This system drained the wealth of the people, kept the farmers in abject poverty, and consistently created conditions that made famine incredibly likely. In 1845, just a few months before the famine struck, a commission was created by the British Parliament to study this issue, the problem of land ownership in Ireland. And they did a pretty thorough job. They interviewed over 1,100 witnesses, many of whom were landlords themselves. The secretary of this commission was actually famous for writing a pro-Irish pamphlet called Instruct, Employ, Don't Hang Them. What this commission of experts discovered was a problem that struck to the very heart of Ireland's psychology. Ireland was a conquered land. And as such, most of Ireland's landlords were alien conquerors who had gained their land through confiscation rather than through purchase. Absentee landlords, many of whom lived in England and never visited their land during their entire lives, would simply extract as much money as possible from the land with no real care for the people who lived there. This had been a problem since the 1370s in Ireland, and by the time of the Potato Famine, Ireland's agricultural economy was stagnant. The citizens were subsistence farmers struggling to live off of meager land holdings, while every pound of income they generated flowed immediately to British landlords. This money was then spent, invested, or saved in England rather than Ireland. This was an enormous and unending drain on the Irish economy. For example, in 1842 alone, £6 million in rent left Ireland. Landlords would visit their land maybe once in an entire lifetime, and therefore had no sympathy or connection whatsoever to the tenants. They would leave all of their power instead to stewards, people who would watch over the land while the landlords were gone. Well, these stewards were hated ferociously by the Irish peasantry. They were rightly nicknamed land sharks. Just as urban slumlords find it profitable to rent a home room by room and charge exorbitant rents for each room, land sharks would split the Irish farms into smaller and smaller holdings. These holdings, most of which were too small to properly feed a family, were then put on the market at hyperinflated prices. The families that rented these tiny plots of land would soon find the rent so enormous as to put them into debt for life. Sometimes 8 families would live on a plot of land that could barely support one family. Land sharks, also nicknamed bloodsuckers by the peasants, reaped huge profits off of this system. While the British Parliament, which had authority over the Irish economy according to the 1801 Act of Union, failed to regulate this land division problem, thereby allowing absentee landlords to become agricultural slumlords. To make it worse, leases at this time were simply unheard of. Of course, the landlord preferred not to have a lease, because he then had the power to evict a tenant at literally a moment's notice. Meanwhile, the tenant couldn't afford a lease anyways, because a £10 fee was required to validate the document. Tenants therefore were completely exposed. They had no legal rights whatsoever when it came to land ownership, leaving them vulnerable to predatory practices and insane price hikes. As the rent went up every year, a tenant's debt to the landlord would increase and remain unpaid for 6 months, a year, or longer. After all, a farmer cannot pay rent without a harvest, and often the harvests were too meager even to feed the family living on the land, let alone to pay off enormous debts, with interest, of course. If in a given year the crop didn't come in at all, then these tenants were immediately evicted. This practice created an army of starving, evicted peasants wandering the countryside in desperation. In reality, eviction equaled death for the peasant family. With no capital to purchase land, the family would wander as beggars until they starved on the roadside. In 1812, the economist Edward Wakefield commented, quote, "This debt hangs over their heads and keeps them in a perpetual state of anxiety and terror." Years later, in 1862, John Stewart Mill wrote, quote, "The entire agricultural population of Ireland can be evicted at the mere will of the landlord." And Benjamin Disraeli, the British Prime Minister, noted in 1847 that Ireland was the most densely populated country in Europe, though many thousands weren't even counted in the census because they lived in bogs, glens, and under tree roots in the forest. The Devon Commission, that group of experts created by Parliament to investigate land ownership, found that the people of Ireland were, quote, "enduring sufferings greater than any other people in Europe." And yet, there was no other industry to which these evicted peasants could turn. Aside from the fact that the farmers were completely uneducated and ignorant of all but even the most rudimentary farming techniques, food production was really the only successful industry in Ireland. Other industrial possibilities in Ireland remained thoroughly unexploited. For example, Ireland had large coal deposits that, even in the 1800s, during the peak of the Industrial Revolution, remained entirely untapped. It was said that coal was of more interest to a geologist than to an Irish industrialist. As for manufacturing, England had an even tighter monopoly on textile production than it did on Irish land. There was no room for fledgling textile businesses to spring up when demand in Ireland was already so thoroughly met by England's incredibly productive factory network. So therefore, only Ireland's land remained a consistent source of revenue, a place the lowest members of society could turn to for work. But since land was the only functioning industry, land became like gold. Rents were 80 to 100% more expensive in Ireland than in England. Meanwhile, the majority of able-bodied, working-age men sat idle on the farms for multiple months every year because there actually wasn't enough work to be done there either. The potato could only be harvested 30 weeks out of the year, so for the remainder of the year, the peasants did not have a tremendous amount of work to do. Farm hands with no other experience were basically unhireable in the off-season, and unemployment rates stayed perpetually high. The statistics are pretty astounding. By the 1840s, there were over 2 million unemployed people in Ireland, a full 25 to 35% of the working-age population. Less money was flowing through the Irish economy than ever before, and to top it all off, there was enormous population growth going on at the same time. From 1779 to 1841, the Irish population grew by 172%. Every baby born was another mouth to feed, and these families were already on the brink of starvation. Health care for the newborns was abominable. In 1841, there were only 39 hospitals in Ireland, and this is a country with a population of 8.2 million. The infant mortality rate in Ireland was higher than 20%. So why were these people reproducing at such a prodigious rate when their incomes were not secure and health care was so bad? Again, the answer lies in the system of land ownership. Since an Irishman's living situation was always so precarious, his only form of old age insurance was to have lots of children. On these tiny plots of subdivided land, a feeble old peasant man needed young lads to raise the food and take care of their father, or he would quickly face eviction and starvation. Irish young people were also married early, sometimes at 16 or younger, and the Irish women were noted for their fertility. A traveler named Arthur Young once said, quote, 19 in 20 of them breed every 2 years. Long live the potato, unquote. Speaking of the potato, as long as the weather and land did what they were supposed to do, these peasant families would end up with a consistent supply of potatoes, a relatively cheap and nutritious food. It turns out that if a potato is mixed with a little buttermilk, it actually provides all the nutrients a human body needs to survive. Irish men were even noted for their strong frames, even though they only ever ate potatoes and buttermilk. This limited diet was actually healthier and cheaper than the English peasant diet of bread and cheese. Potatoes could also be fed to cattle or pigs, and it really did not need much land to grow in abundance. All one required to harvest it was a spade, so there was no need for complex farming technology. As long as the potato didn't fail, the Irish were able to survive quite effectively, despite all the cards being stacked against them. The potato, however, came with some unique problems that the peasantry could not resolve. Number one, the potato did not keep well, so it couldn't be stored all year, unlike grain. After 6 months, the entire crop would rot into pulp, and therefore, every summer the majority of the Irish peasant population would starve nearly to death. Seasonal starvation became a dangerous but accepted part of the peasant calendar. Number two, potatoes carried a high risk of catastrophic disease and total crop failure. There were multiple potato illnesses that could destroy an entire crop at once, and inoculations did not yet exist for potatoes. This vegetable already had a long history of failure in Ireland. Yet problem number three, there was simply no replacement for the potato in Ireland. No grain was as cheap, and all grains required more land than the potato. Irish farmers simply could not grow enough wheat to survive on their tiny, subdivided plots of land. Only the potato worked for the Irish peasants, and therefore the Irish were totally dependent on this dangerously unstable crop. The British Parliament actually studied this problem as well in the 1830s. Many of these short-sighted politicians blamed the Irish peasants for their dependency on the potato, calling them lazy or too stupid to grow other crops, declaring that it was the peasant's own fault that he came so close to starvation every year. The government also refused to send aid to Ireland during the lean months, despite the fact that the British Parliament had sworn to take full responsibility for the Irish people beginning in 1801. The unemployed received no benefits, and workhouses were scarce across the nation. The Irish, second-class citizens in their own country, continued to starve every year, powerless in the face of legalized monopoly and systemic oppression. And this was all happening before the Great Potato Famine. It would only take one more disaster, one truly bad season, and the entire nation of Ireland would go over the edge. This disaster arrived in 1844 in the form of a government report from North America. Apparently, a new disease was ravaging the potato crop in the United States. Entire harvests were being lost. Ireland should be on its guard. Well, even if Ireland had been on its guard, it could not have fathomed the tragedy that lay ahead.